Hello and welcome to HBM's Crypto-Corner for Wednesday, January 19th, 2022. We have a few things to talk about, so let's get started. Legendary Beast of Exmoor, possibly photographed in Devon. Even if your dog is a trained attack canine, the last thing you want to meet on your morning walk is a cat whose nickname is Beast. That seems to be a common occurrence in the UK, with the latest encounter being between a fog walker near Brayford in Devon and the legendary Beast of Exmoor, an alien big cat with a reputation for leaping high fences and killing large numbers of sheep by ripping out their throats. Before you sneer and apply your favorite expression of disbelief, the incident was captured by a wildlife photographer at a distance of just 200 yards. Genuinely think I may have seen a big cat on Exmoor today. I'll put the cropped photo in the comments. It moved cat-like, was running towards a wooded area, and I think it was a big cat, but may be wrong given the unlikelihood. The worst thing is I'll never know. Sam Aston posted his photo on Twitter along with his account of his recent sighting in late December 2021. His report on Facebook pointed out it was about the size of a Labrador but ran like a cat, not a dog. Aston apologized to those who know he's a wildlife photographer, explaining his phone was on maximum zoom and he didn't have his camera. However, his 10-second sighting at such close physical range has him 90% convinced it was the alien big black cat known as the Beast of Exmoor. Now, the photo in question is not included in this article. It's actually on the Twitter feed. And there it is. It's kind of far away, but still. And here's the cropped photo. A photo closer, which look is a cropped photo. You be the judge. During the early 80s, repeated large losses of sheep and lambs increased the notoriety of the Beast of Exmoor. In one such example, a South Molton farmer lost over 100 sheep in the space of 3 months, with injuries suggestive of large cat involvement. A Devon farmer found a puma skull in 2006, confirmed by the British Big Cat Society. However, the official statement by the DEFRA outlined, based on the evidence, DEFRA does not believe that there are big cats living in the wild in England. The tourism site The Best of Exmoor has a special page devoted to its beast, which it says most witnesses describe as typically resembling a panther or puma, dark gray /tan to black, measuring 1 to 2 meters in length, and the beautiful hilly Exmoor National I'm reading something else. And the beautiful hilly Exmoor National Park area of West Somerset and North Devon in southwest England surrounding the River Exe. It's the perfect habitat for wildlife, even though the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, that must be DEFRA, disagrees with the British Big Cat Society, other big cat organizations, and many witnesses across the UK who have seen what could be escaped or released pets of hybrids of such big cats that have lived in the area for decades. The skeptical might well assume that sightings are much more likely to be misidentified domestic cats, dogs, or deer. Certainly, livestock deaths could be attributed to wandering dogs. The Best of Exmoor doesn't want to scare any tourists away, but the Beast of Exmoor has been linked to sheep killings, which could be due to dogs or other smaller wild animals or to cruel humans using them for rituals. Some even suggest the UK big cats are themselves demonic. The British government no longer sends out military sharpshooters to Exmoor to hunt the beast, but the quote-unquote official denials do nothing to dampen those who believe in the legendary beast of Exmoor. Did anyone question the dog? So we have an interesting case here of a large black cat. Could it be real? It's entirely possible. Sasquatch Classics, Daniel Boone and the Yahoo. Daniel Boone was born on November 2nd, 1734, near the present-day town of Reading, Pennsylvania. The sixth of 11 children born to Squire Boone and the former Sarah Morgan. He would go on to earn great fame as a hunter, soldier, politician, statesman, woodsman, and guide. To this day, his is a household name that inspires images of trailblazing adventure and life on a frontier now long gone. Volumes have been written on this legendary figure's life, and of late I have read through several tomes about this American legend. While doing so, one incident related by the great man himself kept popping up that seems to have been given short shrift by each of his biographers. Boone's claim that he once shot and killed a 10-foot-tall, hair-covered beast called a Yahuwah, or Yahoo, in the region that would one day become Kentucky or West Virginia. It is easy to see why a biographer of Boone would not know what to think about such a claim. The man did not suffer fools gladly, nor did he tolerate being thought of as one. This is obvious to anyone who reads about how Boone handled being dragged through a humiliating court-martial in 1778. Though he was found not guilty, and was even given a promotion in rank after the court heard his testimony about the matter in question, the frontiersman remained bitter about the entire affair and rarely spoke of it. The grudge against his accusers is one Boone held until the day he died. Yes, Boone was very conscious of his reputation and public image. That being the case, it seems odd he would make a claim as bizarre as having killed a monster. Some biographers go into more detail than others about the alleged incident. However, all seem to agree on the basic details of how the story came to light. Late in his life, Boone was holding court with a group of distinguished citizens at a dinner held in his honor at an inn in Missouri. At the conclusion of the meal, a question and answer session of sorts seems to have taken place. It was at this time that one of the men in attendance asked for a story. It is unclear if the gentleman asked for the particular yarn he ended up hearing, or if Boone decided on the tale to be told. Either way, the story Boone shared was one of having come upon and shooting a 10-foot-tall, hair-covered Yahoo in the Appalachian wilderness many years before. The old frontiersman did not get too deep into the tale before one of the men listening laughed out loud and declared the story impossible. Accounts indicate that Boone was deeply offended and refused to continue, despite the request of the others in attendance. The awkwardness of the situation led to the premature end of the get-together, and people began making their exits. After most of the others had left, the innkeeper's son petitioned Boone to finish. "I would not have opened my lips had that man remained," said Boone. "Well, we are alone now," the boy replied. The frontiersman is said to have smiled wryly before saying, "You shall have it," and finishing the story for the lad and the few holdouts who quietly made their way back into the room once it was obvious the storytelling had recommenced. While Boone never received much in the way of formal schooling, his spelling was notoriously creative. He read well. His early favorites were history books. It is also said that Boone took a strong liking to Robinson Crusoe. Later, two books dominated the frontier's reading time: the Bible and Gulliver's Travels, written by Irish writer and clergyman Jonathan Swift. Gulliver's Travels became an instant hit upon its publication in 1726. Most likely think they are familiar with the plot of Gulliver's Travels, in which the main character finds himself shipwrecked on the shores of an island nation called Lilliput, and is taken prisoner by a horde of the island's tiny inhabitants. It is true that this is the most well-known part of Swift's masterpiece. However, the tale of Lemuel Gulliver's trials and tribulations among the Lilliputians is just part of the overall work. It is actually the story of Gulliver's fourth voyage that concerns us in regards to the tale told by Daniel Boone. In part 4 of the book, titled A Voyage to the Country of the Houyhnhnms, Gulliver, who is tired of his life as a surgeon, returns to the sea as captain of a merchant vessel. After several crew members die, Gulliver hires replacements out of Barbados and the Leeward Islands. Unfortunately, the new hires turn out to be buccaneers and soon mutiny. The pirates strand Gulliver on the first piece of land they come across and sail away in his ship. It is now that the story becomes relevant to the Boone tale, as the fictional Gulliver soon encounters some terrifying creatures. At last I beheld several animals in a field, and one or two deformed, which a little discomposed me, so that I lay down behind a thicket to observe them better. Their heads and breasts were covered with thick hair, some frizzled and others lank. They had beards, like goats, and a long ridge of hair down their backs. They often stood on their hind feet. Another passage reads, "My horror and astonishment are not to be described when I observed in this abominable animal a perfect human figure. The face of it indeed was flat and broad, the nose depressed, the lips large, and the mouth wide. The 4 feet, arms, of the Yahoo differed from my hands in nothing else but the length of the nails, the coarseness and brownness of the palms, and the hairiness of the backs. There was the same resemblance between our feet, but the same differences, the same in every part of our bodies except to the hairiness and color. I never saw any sensitive being so detestable on all accounts, and the more I came near them, the more hateful they grew." Daniel Boone was intimately familiar with the Yahoos described in Gulliver's Travels. If he had ever come into contact with a huge, hair-covered, human-like beast in his years of traversing the American wilderness, calling the beast a Yahoo, based on the description of the creatures written by Swift, seems natural enough. To this day, the names Yeehoo and Yahoo are used to describe Sasquatch-like creatures said to roam the mountains and forests of Appalachia. Critics say Boone's tale of shooting a Bigfoot-like creature is just a campfire story meant to entertain his rapt followers who hung on his every word. Boone biographer Robert Morgan would seem to concur and wrote, "He, Boone, was also known to tell tales about encountering great hairy monsters like the Yahoos in Gulliver's Travels. Most likely it never happened." It is hard to blame Morgan for having doubts about such a fantastic claim, but he dismisses the tale without any elaboration. While the story might be hard to take at face value, Morgan himself writes about the integrity of Boone and how much he valued his reputation. It would seem proper for the author to explain why the famous woodsman would veer from his character and fabricate a story about having killed a monster, especially when it seems all scholars agree regarding how offended the frontiersman became when his story was challenged. Boone is said to have related the tale of the Yahoo on multiple occasions, most often during the last year of his life. Some have speculated that he might have been losing his faculties during his 85th and final year on this earth. Others correctly point out that the deathbed confession is a real phenomenon. People confess all manner of things when they realize the end of life is near. Such confessions are thought to help alleviate feelings of guilt or regret the dying person may have been harboring during their lifetime. 2. The deathbed declaration. When a dying person shares some secret knowledge, it's not an unusual occurrence. Usually these declarations have to do with feelings the dying individual has for another person. However, sometimes knowledge is shared which the person has been holding on to for years, decades even. Such dying declarations have sometimes been used in court as evidence. Indeed, at times, the final words of a dying man/woman are given more credence in such a scenario, as common sense would seem to indicate that they no longer have anything to lose or gain by sharing what they know. It is true Boone told the story of the Yahoo multiple times over his final years, but not on his literal deathbed. Still, Boone's health was beginning to wane, and any man, once he reached the age of 85, would realize that there was precious little time ahead of him. 2. Men of a certain age often get to a point where they could not care less about what others think of them and no longer concern themselves with how they might be ridiculed. Could the knowledge that his time on earth was short have motivated Boone to relate his incredible tale while he still could? Was it important for him to share the story, one he had kept to himself for years before leaving this mortal plane? Perhaps. It is highly doubtful that the truth about whether or not Daniel Boone shot and killed a Sasquatch-like creature will ever be known. What is inarguable is that Boone spent more time in the American wilderness than just about any white man who has ever lived. That being the case, if the Sasquatch is a real creature, who would have been more likely to eventually come across one than Daniel Boone? So, very fascinating. Did Daniel Boone come across a Sasquatch and shoot it? Who knows? We really don't know. And I don't think we'll ever know, really. But still, it's fascinating to think about. A family's very strange close encounters with Bigfoot. By far, one of the most well-known and well-cited cryptids in history is none other than Bigfoot, also called Sasquatch, a veritable rock star of cryptozoology. These huge hairy hominids have been sighted and searched for all over North America, and there have often been some rather strange and curious accounts indeed. Yet, even more bizarre than sightings of Bigfoot are the occasional tales of people claiming to actually live in close contact with these mysterious creatures, making detailed observations and even forming bonds with them and communicating with them. It is a truly unique phenomenon that is every bit as bizarre as you might expect. This particular phenomenon is typically called Bigfoot habituation. The witnesses often refer to as contactees, and one can almost envision it as a sort of similar to Dian Fossey and her gorillas living together and studying each other. There are numerous such cases, and one fairly major account of Bigfoot habituation comes from the wildernesses of Washington State in the United States, and it revolves around a witness named Sally Shepherd Walford and her family, also being an account that perhaps transcends just hairy hominid encounters to truly catapult to the realms of high strangeness. Walford lived near the town of Ording, Washington in the 70s, along with her daughter Autumn, around which much of the tale seems to gravitate. They lived here in a rustic, modest, somewhat disheveled cabin, described as an 11 by 33 wooden box, with holes in the floor and a cold water faucet, surrounded by quaint wilderness and a sea of trees, but almost as soon as they moved in, there was strangeness afoot. And Walford says in an interview with Jeffrey Pritchett of the Church of Mabus radio show of this day, "When we walked out to view the river, I knew we would live there. When we turned to walk back, my ex yelled, 'Race ya!' and disappeared into the woods. I couldn't recall where we'd come out, so I took the most obvious path. I picked wild flowers as I walked, expecting him to do something to scare me, like jumping out from behind a bush and screaming. And that was when I noticed the woods had become dark and completely quiet. When I looked up, the sky was filled with ominous rolling clouds. I shivered and realized I was not alone, and the presence I felt was not that of my husband. I screamed his name and turned to run. Then a terrible smell wafted by on the sodden breeze. The woods erupted behind me, and I turned toward the sound of ripping foliage. As I watched, something huge and hairy disappeared into the trees. Charged by waves of fear, I began running again, but tripped over a root and landed in the wet sand. I lay still, catching my breath. When I looked up, I noticed the sky had returned to normal. Puffy white clouds stretched peacefully in a pale blue sky. Birds twittered from hidden perches. The fragrance of spring in the forest filled the air. The presence was gone. I summoned up my last bit of courage and retraced my steps until I came upon the spot where I had dropped my flowers. Off to the side of the path, it looked like a tank had gone through the thick underbrush. Then the destruction just stopped. I looked for a place where something that large could have gone farther, but there was none. Broken branches hung like dead snakes as I looked up into the overhanging limbs. I spied a tuft of brown hair caught on one. It was too far up for me to reach, but I finally managed with the aid of a stick. When I pulled it down, I winced at the rancid smell I would never forget. And that's when it hit me just how huge that shape had been. The funny thing is that it had run away just like I had. We had scared each other. For the next 4 years, the family was supposedly frequently visited by these Bigfoot-like creatures, with countless sightings of the beasts lurking about, usually coming in quite closely, and often they were seen by friends and neighbors as well. There were also many such incidents when she and her daughter were together. Walford gives one such encounter thus. We came around a bend on one of the trails behind our cabin, and standing in the dappled shade of the trees were an adult Sasquatch and his much smaller companion. I couldn't have moved if I'd wanted to. With my 3-year-old daughter by my side, I stood frozen in place until the adult broke eye contact. He cocked his head and looked down at the fur coat I was wearing as if to say, "What kind of animal are you?" At that point, my instincts kicked in. I spoke softly when I told Autumn, "Turn around and walk, honey. Don't run." When she was safely out of sight, I turned and followed. The two Sasquatch never moved. When we returned to our cabin, we crawled into bed. My husband was livid when he came home from work because there was no wood to burn. I told him we were sick because I had no other excuse for being in bed. I did not remember that meeting on the trail for over 20 years. What I remember most is the eyes, full of intelligence. They were about twice the size of my own, and no whites were visible. The color was brown, but they had a greenish tint, and were covered with a sort of convex lens like a cat. They were not the eyes of an animal. I had the feeling they looked deep into my soul. Much of this was intertwined with a great deal of other mysterious occurrences, such as myriad light anomalies that appeared in the forest, and Walford says that often the Sasquatch that appeared would have these orbs surrounding them, or wreaths of tiny lights like fireflies orbiting their heads and shoulders. She says of one such encounter, "One night I was looking out the kitchen window and saw the tall, dark form of a Sasquatch walking down the path toward the river. Surrounding his head and upper torso were tiny, twinkling white lights. When I tapped on the window, the lights went out like someone had flipped a switch, and he was swallowed in darkness." It is all very bizarre, and besides sightings of mystery lights and Bigfoot, there was also the unusual detail in that Walford claims that at the time she was also frequently visited by a spectral elderly Native American gentleman who she calls the Dream Walker. This stranger would apparently take her on journeys into the past, guiding her through the history of the Bigfoot of the valley, showing her the early life of the native Chinook tribe and their beliefs and way of life. The two of them roaming around the landscape together and extending out past the reach of time into the past. She says of these excursions, "These journeys, for the most part, were quite disturbing, for they showed me the fate of both the natives and the Sasquatch as they were being pushed further into the forest or violently disposed of. I was given hope for the future of Sasquatch in the form of Dreamwalker's last words to me. Remember all I have shown you and teach your young ones. I will not be here to remind you. Make sure the children believe in what they cannot touch or see. To one of you a girl child has been born. She has the sunbeams in her hair. One day I will come to her as I have come to you. She too will learn the ways of our people in Skookum. It did not occur to me at the time that he was describing my daughter Autumn. As to who Dreamwalker is, I will answer you thus. In one of our later journeys, it was the present time. He led me down the path behind Udi's cabin. I walked around a curve on the path between the huge rotting logs that had been deposited by some ancient flood, and there stood the adult Sasquatch I now know I had met on the path. One minute he was there, and then the next Dreamwalker stood in his place. That answered the question for me, but I'll leave it to others to decide for themselves. With so many incidents of utter strangeness surrounding them, one might think that Walford might take Bigfoot to be some sort of spiritual entity or even an alien. But she seems to think that this is not necessarily the case, tending to believe that they are an unknown form of prehistoric man, although she entertains other possibilities. Considering all of the other phenomena witnessed upon the land, Walford was asked her opinion on whether the Bigfoot she had been seeing were related to aliens and the UFO phenomenon, to which she answers, I've thought long and hard on this question. I don't know that there is a connection, but I wouldn't rule it out. The fact that we experienced both, along with many other anomalies during our time in the valley, could lead one to that conclusion. But the fact that so many strange things happen in one place could be caused by something else entirely. There are so many things that science seems to ignore or can't explain. I've looked into the possibility of a vortex in that area or a junction of ley lines. Native Americans have looked at certain areas near Mount Rainier as sacred for centuries. Sally Shepard Walford has written extensively on these unusual experiences in her book, Valley of the Skookum, 4 Years of Encounters with Bigfoot, if you want to know more. We are left to wonder just what to make of all this. What sort of unknown mysteries were swirling around this family, if any? What is with the more mystical aspects of it? What does any of it mean? Do Bigfoot really congregate around certain people? And if so, why are they unable to provide better evidence of their wild stories? It remains to be seen, and for the time being, the case of Sally Shepard Walford is one of the most in-depth and outright bizarre cases of Bigfoot contactees around, whether any of it is real or not. And she did write quite a bit about some of that stuff in her book, Valley of the Skookum, which I highly recommend, and you can make up your own mind. Finally, East Africa's oldest modern human fossil is way older than previously thought. Analysis of ash from a massive volcanic eruption places the famed Omo 1 fossil 36,000 years back in time. In a remote region in southwestern Ethiopia, the Omo River and its long-vanished tributaries have laid bare rugged bluffs and hillsides, exposing a layer cake of ancient sediments and the trapped remains of early humans. Before the COVID pandemic, Celine Vidal and colleagues journeyed to this site known as the Kibish Formation to work in scorching temperatures up to 110 degrees Fahrenheit, picking through the ashes of ancient volcanic eruptions to learn more about some of the oldest members of our species. It was an adventure, says Vidal, a volcanologist at the University of Cambridge who studies how ancient eruptions impacted climate and civilizations. This is the part of science that online life is never going to replace. One of the reasons Vidal and colleagues came to the site was to learn more about Omo 1, one of the oldest known examples of Homo sapiens. Using geochemical clues to match the layer of volcanic ash blanketing the fossil to a specific volcanic eruption, they discovered Omo 1 is 36,000 years older than previously believed. Ash from an enormous eruption of the Ethiopian Rift's Shala volcano was put down atop the sediment layer, containing the Omo-1 fossil approximately 233,000 years ago, which means that Omo-1 and her kind lived here at least that long ago. Each eruption has a unique geochemical composition, a kind of fingerprint which we can use to try and figure out exactly which eruption on the Ethiopian rift would have created a layer of volcanic ash, Vidal explains. We found a match for the ash layer that covers the fossils, so we knew which eruption produced that ash and the age of that eruption. The findings, published this week in the journal Nature, show that Omo-1 had to be older than the layer that later fell from the sky to rest atop her remains, but they don't reveal her maximum age. It may later be possible to determine the oldest possible date for Omo-1 if the team can similarly identify another volcanic layer from below the fossil. Famed paleoanthropologist Richard Leakey and colleagues found Omo-1 near the southern Ethiopian town of Kibish in 1967. Originally, scientists dated freshwater mollusk shells found with the skull to conclude that the remains were about 130,000 years old. They also saw from the beginning quite clearly that the skull's flat face, prominent chin, and high forehead were distinctly modern, and that this ancient person should be classified as a member of our own species. For more than half a century, the fossil has been known as one of the oldest existing Homo sapiens skulls anywhere in the world. The partial skull and skeleton were considered the oldest until the 2017 discovery of 300,000-year-old skull, jaw, and tooth fragments from Jebel Ehud, Morocco. In 2005, radioactive dating study pushed back the age of the fossil skull significantly to 195,000 years ago. But today's study now suggests that Omo-1 is actually tens of thousands of years older. The era in which Homo sapiens likely first appeared and gradually evolved in Africa between about 360,000 years ago and 100,000 years ago was one of cataclysmic volcanic activity. Enormous eruptions rocked the region, depositing thick layers of ash that would have made some localities uninhabitable. Because changing environments sometimes pushed early humans to adopt new behaviors and tools, these eruptions might have actually played a part in shaping evolution here. Perhaps they caused groups of ancient humans to move around, encountering one another and exchanging everything from genes to technologies before separating again. More certainly, the volcanic ash helped to create a record of what happened during the turbulent era. At the Kibish Formation, researchers were stumped by a massive layer of ash more than 6 feet thick, just above the sediments where Omo-1 and other fossils were found. At a distance of nearly 200 miles away from the nearest ancient volcano, the ash was flour-like, so fine that it lacked enough large crystals to be used for radiometric dating, which provides an age by measuring how much of the mineral's radioactive potassium has decayed into radioactive argon. This material just wasn't suitable for the type of techniques we normally use, Vidal explains. But Vidal and colleagues were able to determine the age of the eruption that deposited the ash by sampling rocks closer to their volcanic sources, in places where ashy debris contained plenty of larger crystals suitable for radiometric dating. It's really neat work to be able to go to the volcanic complexes and collect samples right from the source and connect them chemically in a very precise way to what was found at the fossil site itself, says Rick Potts, director of the Smithsonian's Human Origins Program, who wasn't involved with the study. Dates for important fossils like Omo-1 are extremely important for scientists who are piecing together an evolutionary timeline of Homo sapiens. They provide a solid framework to help track changes in evolution, like human appearance, or in behavior, like tool technologies. They also lend context to events like dramatic climate shifts that may have helped drive those adaptations. In any given region, it is useful to establish the earliest appearance of something that looks very, very much like a Homo sapiens skull, says Potts, and that's Omo-1. Omo-1's fascinating skull shape shows that humans living in eastern Africa 230,000 years ago had already evolved to the point that they looked much like ourselves. But that's not the whole story. Leakey's team found a second set of remains at the site, dubbed Homo 2, which appears to be the same age but has a quite different and more archaic look that has sparked debate on whether it's truly a Homo sapiens. From about 350,000 to 160,000 years ago, the human fossil record shows a mixing and matching of different traits in different times and places, some of which are more primitive and others more modern. This paradigm makes the remains of Homo 1 and Homo 2 particularly interesting, Potts notes, because such variation can be seen side by side. Whether it may be the same gene pool or two neighboring groups of hominins, this basis for the combining of archaic and modern-looking traits is sort of encapsulated by what happened to be two fossil individuals collated at Kibish by Richard Leakey in the 1960s, Potts says. As is true for many animals, the origin of our own species wasn't an event but a more gradual process that took place over time. So we have another species of human which is believed to be older, much older than previously believed. And that's going to do it for this week. I want to thank you very much for tuning in. You guys are the heart of the show. I always say that, but I always mean it, and I will continue to do this as long as you guys want me to. And hey, until next week, y'all be good, be good at. This has been HBM's Crypto Corner.